everyone, and welcome to CSI Skill Tree. In this series, we take a close look at video games to examine and celebrate the work they do in envisioning the future and building rich, thought-provoking worlds. My name is Joey Eshrick at Arizona State University Center for Science and the Imagination, and I'll be your host. Today, we're discussing how some role-playing games, and particularly a cycle of games developed and published in Japan in the 80s and 1990s, blend science fiction and fantasy to tell compelling stories about environmental collapse, the perils of technological hubris, the long consequences of war, and the potential for solidarity in the midst of tragedy. The game we're going to focus on is Chrono Trigger, which is a 1995 time-hopping adventure that's often featured on lists of the best and most influential games of all time. It's notable for its alchemy of ideas from science fiction and fantasy, which come together to produce a memorable and socially and politically engaged kind of text. The game was both developed and published by Square, and it's the brainchild of what was at the time called the Dream Team. Designers Hironobu Sakaguchi, creator of the Final Fantasy series, and Yuji Horii, creator of the Dragon Quest series, along with Akira Toriyama, a manga artist and character designer best known for the Dragon Ball series. And beyond these three, the rest of the team is also stacked with renowned developers, designers, and artists, including the composers Yasunori Mitsuda and Nobuo Uematsu, director and co-writer Takashi Tokita, producer Kazuhiko Aoki, and writer Masato Kato. All of these creators have continued to make artistically and commercially successful and genre-defining games. And so this Chrono Trigger is a kind of unique moment of collaborative alignment among people who have achieved great creative success with other longer-running game franchises. Just before we get too deep into this, a quick note on availability for this game. If you want to play it, if you haven't picked it up yet or had a chance to experience it, Chrono Trigger was originally released for the Super Nintendo console. It's been ported a bunch of times to different consoles, including the original PlayStation and the Nintendo DS. And more recently, there are versions available on mobile platforms like iOS and Android. You could play it on Windows computers through the game service Steam. It's widely available, but maybe not quite as available, strangely, as some other classics from this period. So you might have to hunt around for it a bit, but there are lots of ways to get it working if you're committed. So, we're going to talk quite a bit about the plot later, but just to set the table, Chrono Trigger follows a diverse group of protagonists from across different moments in the history of a planet over the span of millions of years. And so, for instance, the first three characters are from 1000 CE, but another's from 65 million BCE, and another highly intelligent robot is from 2300 CE. After stumbling on a prototype time travel device at a fair and having some misadventures with it, the protagonists discover that a giant mysterious creature is going to destroy the world 1,000 years into the future. And so they vow to use their time travel abilities to prevent the apocalypse. By jumping back and forth across 7 different time periods, players uncover the ancient history of this planet-killing creature, which is called Lavos. They also discover the history and future of people and civilizations attempting to harness the power of Lavos, oppressing people, building empires, hatching their own schemes to defeat the creature, surviving an ice age, the calamitous crash of a floating continent, and other disasters, environmental, arcane, and otherwise. And the game uses a turn-based combat system with actions like attacking with weapons, using items, and casting spells selected from menus. It complicates this with what's called an active time battle system, which adds some hurry and urgency to making selections on the fly. So it's a sort of early attempt at sort of fusing a more action-oriented style with the kind of menu-based combat that was quite typical at the time for this sort of game. In the mid-90s era in which it came out, Chrono Trigger stands out for a few reasons, and we're going to get into all these. So this is almost a map for the conversation in some sense. First, because of its multiple possible endings, which depend on the player's choices and whether they complete certain tasks. Second, because of its deep writing with lovable multidimensional characters facing social and political quandaries. And finally, because of how our bonds with the protagonists are developed, particularly in the third act through these lengthy side stories, which trace the character arcs of each member of the adventuring party through trauma, tragedy, and disappointment. And so completing these quests with these cohorts of yours often leads them to acceptance, self-actualization, or some sort of meaningful epiphany or philosophical realization. As we'll discuss again, I keep saying that, but Chrono Trigger is not dramatically open-ended. But these features taken together coalesce to create this feeling of incredible agency and responsiveness, something that was fresh at the time, but perhaps we've come to expect and demand quite a bit from narratively rich games at this stage. This kind of fusion of combining the journeys of unfolding a complicated story, solving a trans-historical mystery, and building relationships with your friends proved quite successful. And that fusion of elements has continued to be at the heart of role-playing video games, even into this year, 2024. Okay, so I keep saying we're about to talk about, and here's the people we're going to do it with. To dig into all of this further, I'm fortunate to have two amazing guests with me. So first, Troy L. Wiggins. Troy, welcome. Thank you for being here. Troy is a writer and editor based in Memphis, Tennessee. His work focuses on Black speculative fiction, the Black imagination, Afrofuturism, and liberation technologies. His short fiction has appeared in anthologies like Memphis Noir and Black Panther Tales of Wakanda. And he's written nonfiction for periodicals including MLK 50 Memphis, Literary Orphans, and Reactor. He co-edited the international fiction anthology Trouble the Waters, Tales from the Deep Blue, and co-founded and co-edited Faya, a literary magazine of Black speculative fiction that has won the Hugo Award and World Fantasy Award. And Aidan Moher is my second guest. Aidan is a writer of speculative fiction and nonfiction based in Vancouver Island, British Columbia in Canada. He is the author of the excellent book, Fight Magic Items, The History of Final Fantasy, Dragon Quest, and the Rise of Japanese RPGs in the West, which was published in 2022 by Running Press and was a huge influence on the kind of formation and themes of the conversation that we're going to have here. He founded the Hugo Award-winning speculative fiction blog, A Dribble of Ink, as well as Astrolabe, a newsletter on science fiction, fantasy, and retro video games. And his work has appeared in Wired, Washington Post, Electronic Gaming Monthly, Kotaku, Reactor, and a variety of other outlets. So I've got just the right people here to discuss this game, and thank you so much for making the time to be here with me. And I say let's get underway and do it.
Sounds good.
Sounds good to me. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, you're very welcome. I'm honored. So I want to start just by asking how each of you came to Chrono Trigger. I know that both of you have quite a long history with role-playing video games, and particularly ones developed in Japan, but your sort of pathways to actually playing this game were quite different. So Aidan, I'd love to start with you if that's all right.
Yeah, absolutely. So I go back, and my relationship with Chrono Trigger goes all the way back to the mid 90s when it first came out. I fell into Japanese RPGs, like console RPGs, thanks to Final Fantasy VI or Final Fantasy III at the time. Played a lot of it at my friend's house, played a lot of it myself, and we finished it, and all I knew is that I needed whatever came next. And that was Chrono Trigger. And so I scoured magazines at the time for Chrono Trigger coverage. I knew it was made by the Final Fantasy guy. I wasn't really aware of Dragon Quest at the time or Yuji Horii. I didn't have much experience with Akira Toriyama's art. So it was like the Final Fantasy connection. And I just, every preview I could get my hands on from, Japanese coverage and, import coverage and previews and stuff. I just ate up and ate up and ate up and got obsessed with this game that wasn't even out yet. Finally, it came out. I had to wait a couple of months. I think I got it for my birthday, which is, I think it came out in September. I didn't get it until a couple of months later for my birthday. And then from that point on, it was just like I just fell in love with it. It was, as we will talk about extensively. I think it's just such a strong melding of like two of my major influences as a kid, which was science fiction and fantasy, and how it included all of that in there, and so many different variations on those themes just hit so close to home for me. And I played through it, beat it, and then of course it launched into like New Game Plus, which was like, oh, I don't have to leave this game behind. This game can be something that is a continuous part of my life. And so it did. It stuck around with me forever, and I still, play through it yearly, more or less. So it's been around, and I've had, yeah, it's just been in my life since it came out, since before it came out.
Yeah, it's a really good point to bring up to add to the list of kind of unique or surprising features at the time, I feel like for a lot of us, which is that like the idea that the game ended, but then you could kind of delve back into the world. So the world
Mhm.
didn't close, the book
Yeah.
didn't close on you
And the
when you
experience
finished.
changed big time the second time around because it
Mhm.
becomes more of like an adventure narrative game. Because the RPG elements take a backseat to like exploring the world, exploring the,
Mm,
characters and the themes and the story and experiencing that over again. It's
yeah,
interesting.
fantastic. Troy, how about you? A very different road.
Very different, very different. So very happy to be here discussing this amazing game and all of the interesting just ideas that it contains and interesting mechanics. I am a longtime gamer. I've been gaming the majority of my adult life. Um, but Chrono Trigger, this is the first time I played this game. I've heard about this game. I've had a relationship to this game for a long time because it's my best friend's favorite game. So I've been hearing my best friend Adrian, shout out to Adrian. I've been hearing my best friend Adrian talk about this game since we were in like fifth or sixth grade, maybe.
Mhm.
Like Chrono Trigger is my favorite game. I did not have a Super Nintendo growing up. I grew up in a household where we could only afford one console at a time, typically for years. And so for years, I had a Sega Genesis. And so that shaped a lot of my gameplay. I graduated from that to the PlayStation. And the other thing that shaped my gameplay taste were my older cousins and the older people in my household. So even though I'm the oldest of my siblings, I was not the oldest young person in my household. So typically my older cousins would decide what games we played. And so that would mean we were playing like Tecmo Bowl or NBA Jam or Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat. We weren't playing RPGs. So I didn't encounter this game naturally until my friend told me about it. And I never played it until playing it to prepare for this talk. So this is my very first time playing this game. And we're going to get into this later, but playing this game as an adult that has played a lot of RPGs over the past 2 decades of 2, 3 decades of gaming was just mind blowing. It was I don't think it's an experience you can quite like. I don't know all the way how to explain it. Like I don't know. We'll talk about it. I'll talk about my feelings throughout the conversation. But very amazing experience playing this for the first time as an elder millennial gamer.
Yeah, we're gonna try to figure out all of our emotions about this together, I promise. But yeah, no, so I mean, just to briefly throw in, like I had a similar experience, Troy, in that I played a lot of the games that this is in conversation with, but I also didn't have a Super Nintendo at home, and I just missed it entirely. And I think that I'd read and heard so much about it that I always to some extent always felt like I had actually experienced it myself and I'd seen the screenshots and art, but to actually obviously get into the world and get to know the characters and author to some extent your own narrative, navigate your own way through it is very different. So, but I also
Mhm.
like your story, Troy, makes me think that like when you're sharing a console or computer or whatever with people, like it is actually a harder sell when you're young or when we were young to play these long role playing games. Like it's a much easier sell to play sports or fighting or whatever. Some of the titles you mentioned, which are familiar to me
Mhm.
too, because it's like you can play multiplayer. You're sharing. You don't have to fight over the controller or fight
Exactly.
over save
Exactly.
files. Yeah, I think it's an interesting context thing in terms of like the sorts of genres of games and the kinds of narrative experiences you can actually get based on like whether you have your own device or not. So it is nice to play it as an
Yeah.
adult when you have a little more control over your environment and time, I think,
Absolutely.
to some extent too.
Yeah.
Um, Troy, I want to stick with you and just ask like, you know, you mentioned having played a lot of other games and so you felt like you had some context in which your experience was enmeshed. So like what struck you playing something so canonical and influential after so long after its release, and did
Mhm.
something really stick out, or did it kind of like help you resituate your understanding of some other games and experiences that you've loved?
Yeah, yeah. Before I get to the question, I know about playing it. So I actually emulated this game. So I'm playing I think this is the 1996 ROM. You know what I mean? So I'm playing the game as Aiden would have played it in his childhood, but just on a MacBook Pro with a PlayStation 4 controller. So this is a really, I think, disjointed gaming experience to have with this game. Like I'm playing it like on my lap while my wife's playing Veilguard, or playing it like in between Zoom calls at work. So it's a very interesting
Mhm.
like way I experienced the game as well. I didn't experience it like like my friend Adrian would have in his bed, in his pajamas eating pizza, playing the game. You know what I'm saying? I was playing it amongst my life, which I think also kind of impacted how I approached it and how it impacted me really. Um, but yeah, I think the biggest unveiling I had playing Chrono Trigger going through is just I think how many core not just JRPG mechanics, but how many core gaming mechanics this game either spearheaded or I would say perfected in a sense. I think we talked about New Game Plus, right? Like I wasn't aware of New Game Plus in that terminology as a concept until like Demon Souls. You know what I mean? Or until like very later games that were already kind of deviating from the JRPG kind of framework, right? So I mean you could call Demon Souls a JRPG if you wanted to, but that was when I first learned about like New Game Plus as a real thing, or maybe like God of War or something like that, so a game not connected to JRPG. So all of these different little mechanics that are commonplace in JRPGs now, that are commonplace in games now, having, multiple endings, having your choices really matter from the start of the game. You know what I mean? Every decision you make being influential. Just knowing that those elements started this early in gaming, they didn't start in the PS2 era, right? They were things that existed on the Super Nintendo. I think was really mind blowing. I mean, I think really shows um, how aligned, how star-crossed this game was in terms of its development and in terms of the talent that worked on it. Because when and Aidan has a really great piece about like the history, done a lot of great writing about the history and development cycle and the elements that went into development, the personalities that went into development, and the game can show you these things. If you persist and get an appropriate ending, the game can show you these characters, these people who made this game. But I think it's really interesting that just how many factors went into this game being able to be as influential and as groundbreaking as it is. It's even on a larger cartridge. Like, you know what I mean? Like
Mhm.
that's amazing to consider. And so like, of course, when you think about it from that perspective, like the ATB system is probably one of my favorite expressions of the ATB, and that's the active time battle system, the system that makes combat a little more, it adds another layer of strategy to it because your decisions do exist in real time. You're not waiting like in some other turn-based role-playing game systems. And so like things like that are really what stuck out to me. All of the different mechanics. I think about this game a lot in concert with Final Fantasy 16 and how that game was using mechanics, especially action mechanics, to focus to make the combat a separate thing. You know what I mean? Not necessarily an integrated part of what's happening, even though you could, but just like a thing that you're almost like a separate game. Like you're playing the narrative elements, and then here goes combat, and it's really fun and has its own elements of development to it, right? So like I think that's
Mhm.
really the biggest thing that stuck out to me, especially again playing this as an adult, having played games for 20 years and seeing all these little pieces and RPGs and other games popping up in Chrono Trigger again, 1996, 1995, 1996. So it's really wild.
Yeah. Yeah, I should say, by the way, for folks who may not be as familiar with these kinds of games, when we say New Game Plus, and I kind of alluded to it
Mhm.
earlier, it means you can, after the game ends, after you reach an ending, you can start the game again, usually, or sort of carry forward your progress and items and all the skills and that your characters have learned and continue to explore. Sometimes that means starting over and starting the story over again, and sometimes that means being able to continue to explore or go after really difficult secret bosses, depending on the game. But as I understand it, this was an early example of having that New
I
Game
think it
Plus
was
option.
the first game
Oh
that
wow.
used New Game Plus. There were some other games that sort of
Mhm.
used the concept in their design, but I think it was the first game that actually coined that phrase New Game Plus, which is kind of
Mhm.
ubiquitous. To touch quickly on
Mhm.
something Troy mentioned earlier, or alluded to, um, I think it's something like a dozen Chrono Trigger staffers went on to direct their own like
Mhm.
RPG sized games for Square. And I think like what Troy's identifying is that, you know, you had this team, this dream team, which was like highlighted by the big names, Yuji Horii, who created Dragon Quest, Hironobu Sakaguchi, who created Final Fantasy. But working with them on staff were people that had the talent and the experience and the drive to create whole video games, whole RPGs,
Mhm.
and you had them focused on small specific examples. So you had somebody who was
Mm-hmm.
working on ATB who was not just, like a junior staffer underneath somebody with a lot of vision. It was somebody who had the capability to create something great, but they were so hyper focused on one specific part of Chrono Trigger that that part of Chrono Trigger became great. And then in the cubicle next door, the next person was doing the same thing and the next person over. And then those people,
Mm-hmm.
that sort of greatness sort of just coalescing in one office then became Square's empire through the PlayStation era and beyond, which I think is just fascinating. Like it was a dream team, not just in the big names, but everybody they assembled around them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Aidan, do you feel like, similarly to what I asked Troy, that like playing this at the point that you did, like, did it change your expectations or your way of thinking about other role-playing experiences or story-rich games that you came across as a young person?
Yeah, I mean, when I was young, so Chrono Trigger came out in 95, so I was 12, 11 or 12 when I played it. Before that, and before Final Fantasy VI, I didn't really like RPGs, especially console
Mm-hmm.
RPGs. I, bounced off them on the Game Boy and bounced them off them when, friends would be playing them. And Final Fantasy VI sort of opened my eyes to what that could be. It was like, oh, I really liked epic fantasy and science fiction books. And it was like, here's a book that you can play. And that was
Mhm.
really cool. It was then Chrono Trigger that took me from like, oh, this is kind of a neat genre to like, oh, this is it for me. Like,
Mhm.
this is crafted as something that I want to be part of. And so in that way, like Chrono Trigger kind of took the door that Final Fantasy VI cracked open and blew it open for me and set me on the path that I am on today. So, personally it's very important to me, but it also just showed
Mm-hmm.
me how like there's sort of the storybook element, the storytelling, the epic fantasy novel in video game form aspect to it, but just also the sense of agency within the world. Like, we've talked offline about how in some ways, Chrono Trigger is a lot of smoke and mirrors in terms of how it uses
Mm-hmm.
causality.
Yeah.
And there isn't a lot of causality in the game, but it appears that there is. And when I was 11, that made me feel like I was, really strongly in control of a narrative that was playing out. Now that I've played the game 20 times and seen that no matter like how if you play through it all the way to the end, no matter what choices you make or whatever, like it kind of all plays out the same way. Your only real choice is when do you beat the game, and that's when the game's
Mm-hmm.
15 endings or whatever comes into play.
Mhm.
But that's just like a one binary choice. Do I beat the game now? Do I beat the game later? um but at the time it was like, okay, I can have an epic fantasy novel that I can play and be part of, but I can be an active participant in that fantasy novel. The choices that I
Mhm.
make matter. The choices that I make are those that the protagonist is making. So I'm not watching
Mm-hmm.
somebody else's story. I'm not reading somebody else's story. I'm playing through my story. And that was
Yeah.
what Chrono Trigger, more than Final Fantasy VI, did for me, was made me feel like an active participant sort of within a narrative. And I'd never experienced
Yeah.
that before.
Yeah. I think it's one of the best examples of that kind of that silent protagonist that we know. So typically JRPGs, some JRPGs, not all, have protagonists that you can identify yourself with, right? So the protagonist doesn't speak typically. I think Chrono. I feel like I read somewhere that Chrono only has like two lines in the whole like, and this is like one random ending that you get to see Chrono actually speak. But for the most of the game, you don't hear him speak. And I think Chrono Trigger does that really well. Some other games that I played don't do that well. And that's one of the other things that I again thinking about like how this game originated, and I think perfecting on some of these JRPG concepts that are memes now. I listen to podcasts where I listen to younger gamers talk about JRPGs, and it's very mimetic how they talk about JRPGs now. But like this game really did open the box on a lot of these elements that 20, 25 years later are um are jokes in a sense. And I think that's interesting to think about it in the context of JRPGs themselves, right? And the lifespan that they've had in the West and in North America, and how this kind of arc of JRPG. So I'm interested. I'm looking forward to us talking about like in the current moment as well, because like I think about like what Aiden said. Like I wonder how I would have been changed or how different I would be in terms of my relationship to JRPGs and even my relationship to fantasy literature if I played this when I was 8 or 9 years old, right? Instead of playing Mortal Kombat or Tekken 2 or whatever. So that's a wondering that
Mhm.
even in the context of this conversation has come out, and I'm very curious because I think my first JRPG may have been Final Fantasy VII. It may have been Super Mario RPG. I can't remember, maybe Pokemon
Hmm.
Red. You know what I mean? Like I don't remember
Yeah.
exactly what my first JRPG was, but I do know that there was a point where I played a Final Fantasy, I played a Breath of Fire, I played Dragon Quest Six, and I was like, yo, there's something in these games that I really like. And of course, it's the fantasy elements. But then, of course, there are other things. There are these deeper thematic pieces that really resonate with me. And I love the way that these games are
Mhm.
looking at stories that we've seen, current events and areas and histories that we already know about, but applying this different kind of perspective and different kind of lens to it. But that didn't happen with Chrono Trigger, right? That happened with some later JRPGs. So I wonder. Well, maybe I should, get my friend to build a time travel device, Adrian, and then we go back and explore these alternative timelines and see what that might look like.
Troy, you've led me in beautifully to what I want to ask Aidan about next. But I do want to pause to say, I think, Aidan, I've been thinking a lot about this kind of the idea that you put forward of like the smoke and mirrors that we talked about offline, that we're talking about now. Like I think for me, my experience this time, first time was like that, it does the magic trick I think that gets pulled off is the game gives you a sense of agency without, and this is what I was trying to hint at in my little introduction, was that it creates this environment like, and I think you unpacked it beautifully, that you feel like you're in a storybook, and so there is a beginning and end, and there's a lot of prescribed elements, but like you do feel like you're authoring your own path through it, and it does feel like you're in a moral universe in which choices and the way you treat people matters. And so the story, I think, really like imbues those little moments of player choice, even if they're not that mechanically consequential, with a lot of power. And so it just sort of puts it on you as the player to behave carefully and responsibly in this world. And so I
Mhm.
think that's an interesting. I think the discourse around certain types of video games in the 2020s has really fetishized the notion of player choice as like having these like
Mhm.
endlessly branching narratives and being able to break the world of the game in some ways
Yeah.
with often really antisocial or unexpected types of choices. And this game
Mhm.
doesn't have that huge tree of decisions, but it does have a narrative in which choice and causality are deeply important. And so it puts you in the frame of mind of having a lot of control, even if
Mhm.
that's not reflected in the game's code, so to speak.
Yeah. And like one of the things I'm playing Life is Strange double exposure right now. And it's famous, it's from Square Enix. And it's the first Life is Strange sort of famously has this bifurcated ending, and you make
Mm-hmm.
a majorly consequential choice at the end, and that really defines the players and the player base's relationship with the first game. And the developer and Square Enix as a publisher has sort of avoided going back to those same characters, because how do you reconcile the idea that a player has immense agency within a world and then create a sequel that satisfies both of them? And they're
Mhm.
under fire for a lot of from a lot of fans who don't feel like double exposure satisfies what happened at the end of Life is Strange. And the choice I made, like I'm very strongly in favor of one of the endings of Life is Strange, and I think double exposure works really well as a sequel to that ending. I think it works really poorly as a sequel to the other ending. And so Chrono Trigger, I think, was coming to a time when in the West, and we'll probably talk about sort of the like cultural exchange and the cyclical nature of like Western and Japanese role-playing games and
You
video
can
games and
feel free to talk
creators.
about that
Yeah.
now if you feel like you
So
need
like,
to need
sure.
to. Yeah.
I mean, from the beginning, and I talk a lot about this in my book, like RPGs, console RPGs, as popularized by Hori and Sakaguchi with Final Fantasy and Dragon Quest in Japan for the NES, were always a result of cultural exchange. They were
Mhm.
looking towards wizardry and Ultima as,
Mhm.
abstractions of tabletop RPGs like Dungeons and Dragons created by Western creators, and looking at how to create an experience for living room gamers in Japan that took the ideas from Ultima and Wizardry and made them possible on a low powered, low memory NES system that also worked on a TV with a controller. And so they were sort of abstracting those Western ideas, bringing them forward. By the time Chrono Trigger is coming out, you're starting to see Western RPGs really leaning heavily into like choice-based narratives. And so Ultima and games like that had a lot of choice in them about how you approach the world, but that was more in sort of a loose, non-linear way, right? The experience itself was the narrative. Whereas you get to Baldur's Gate and you get to Neverwinter Nights, released in the 90s alongside stuff like Chrono Trigger. And those are very like, narratively driven, like branching story paths where everybody does have their own experience, but it also sticks to like a much more structured story than something like Ultima did. Chrono Trigger, once again, was on an underpowered system, low on memory. Even on its gigantic Super Nintendo card, it still didn't have the ability to have 256 versions of Chrono Trigger on there in the way that Baldur's Gate could have 256 variations on Baldur's Gate on somebody's PC hard drive. And so you had something that needed to use, I think, just the perception of choice and causality, get the player in there feeling like they're making active choices, even though everybody has to basically make the same choice to progress the plot. Like, every step of the way, if you're progressing the main plot, everybody has to make the same choice to get there. In smaller bubbles within Chrono Trigger, they give you a little bit more of that cause and effect feeling. And so you have like the classic example is at the beginning of the game where they go into the time paradox of like Marl getting zapped back to the past and then getting discovered and they think she's the queen. So then she gets, the real queen's still kidnapped. So then Marl can't be born. And then, it gives this idea that choice and tampering with time is a threat to existence. They never really return to that, right? There isn't really a lot of the chaos theory, butterfly flaps its wings sort of stuff later in the game, but they do return to it at the end where you have, the Fiona Forest side quest. So, there's a desert in 1000 AD and there's an opportunity to go back in time, plant a tree, and then it turns into a forest. Pretty cool. Like there's like a link of causality there. And that's like one of the only side quests you can actually mess up by making a choice in the game. You have to go to, 12,000 AD or sorry, BC or whatever they call them in the game. And there's like a random commoner and they have a tree sapling. You can either say like, hey, burn this or don't. And if you tell them to burn it, you can't complete the side quest. And the desert stays a desert. And that's sort of the only point in the whole game where like the player can make a choice between two, existences for Chrono Trigger. There's like the desert Chrono Trigger or the forest Chrono Trigger. Otherwise, like we said, the choices are when you beat the game for which ending you get, or which of the side quests do you go through at the end of the game before going on to the ending. And then they kind of play around with narrative ideas of causality, like, you go back in time and have to find the rainbow shell and then store it at the castle so you can make the weapons. But then the castle's like on lockdown because the chancellor is like, authoritarian because of what happened. So like narratively, like it plays with those ideas, even if the player doesn't actually have agency within that. And I think that that's also not, it's sort of a constraint of the system it was developed on. But it was also, sort of just fit nicely into the idea of what console RPGs were at the time. And they were interested in telling more sort of linear, constrained, consistent stories across their 30 hours than what PC RPGs were doing at the time, which was emulating sort of the open-ended player agency of tabletop RPGs. And so you had this like bifurcation point in the 80s when Hori and Sakaguchi decided to make a Japanese living room version of Wizardry and Ultima, and then sort of spawned its new thing. And they sort of, I'm doing like a DNA double helix motion on camera, and that's always what it's reminded me of. It's sort of this double helix of like inspiring and being inspired by each other.
Yeah, yeah. It strikes me, Aidan, that bifurcation you talked about, it is a kind of creative choice too, a poetic choice, which is, do you want people to have a uniformity of experience with your text? It means that people who encounter Chrono Trigger can talk to each other really freely about the game once they've played through, and they'll have basically the same set of reference points. Whereas if you talk to someone who played one of those early Baldur's Gate computer RPGs, like what you're doing more is comparing how things turned out differently, right? Like you're exploring the possibility space versus like kind of recounting. It gives this kind of game a more mythical or folkloric quality, which I think,
Yeah,
which I
absolutely.
think
Yeah.
is a key part of its appeal too.
the themes sort of are more entrenched in, what the creators want you to take out of those. Whereas something like, BioWare is famous for kind of giving you choices that like you think you're making the quote unquote good choice, and then it turns out, hours later that you've kind of made the bad choice, and it's sort of showing
Mhm.
how choice can be,
Right.
dangerous in and of itself, which I think is just, just as interesting, but it is a very different way of telling a story and
Yeah.
teaching the player or the reader what their sort of role is within other people's narratives.
So I wanna turn us towards the starting premise of our conversation and exchanges around this game, which is this unique fusion, I think, uniquely concocted fusion of science fiction and fantasy elements. And we've been talking through and around this quite a bit, but I want to see if the two of you can talk a bit more about how you think that works. Some examples, why you think it works in this particular game, what it allows the writers to do, what it allows audiences to do in terms of meaning making. So, Chrono Trigger isn't unique in this regard, and actually, many games have come up in this conversation already. But Final Fantasy VI is a good example of another game that freely blends archetypes and
Mhm.
ideas from different genres, particularly science fiction and fantasy. But we picked Chrono Trigger because it's renowned and because we think it does this uniquely well and in a uniquely influential way to talk about. And so yeah, I was wondering like if you two could talk a bit about how you think that fusion is pulled off and maybe even what other genres are kind of leaking into the text or kind of like voicing themselves within the text alongside science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here because I I think I know I've talked a lot about genres just not being and there's a general understanding that genres are very porous, that we know that those are marketing categories created to create connections between readers and narratives, and to easily categorize those types of narratives. um I think though, the really cool thing about Chrono Trigger, especially again with all of my knowledge of narrative coming into this game, is the fact that, to the point we made earlier, there is no deep examination of the hidden rules that make the science work, or the
Mhm.
hidden reasons, the hidden ways that folks invoke magic spells, right? I think the game does a really good job of hand waving that stuff in favor of the philosophical implications of using these things, the historical implications, and the historical unveilings in the origins of these things. I think primarily of magic in this game, as a really cool kind of micro examination of the game's themes in its origins, and just as not a technology that was designed primarily to consolidate power for a particular group of
Mhm.
people, right? And not this benevolent force that heroes are granted to be able to save the world, right? And so I
Yeah.
remember coming to that point in the game and understanding that actually the Kingdom of Zeal manufactured magic using like genetic testing and speculative evolution and biotechnology and all that stuff to create magical ability in humans. That blew me. I was like, yo, I mean, like, of course I've encountered that concept before, but I think one of my most the elements of the fusion of science fiction, fantasy, those elements and those tropes, is when we um we look at the ways that the very rigorous, the things that are bound by rules, right, transform themselves into the esoteric, into the things we can't
Mhm.
understand, and kind of pull back the veil for us. And so I think that with Chrono Trigger, especially with you mentioned that the folkloric aspects of this game, I really focused in on how the technology was often um, kind of the veil separating what the characters and we understood to be true with what was actually true in terms of the game's history, right? So I think about like time travel as a device in this game. Like, and I want to point out that the veil is something that does exist in a lot of culture's folklore. This idea that there is a separation between, and we're talking about Dragon Age Veilguard, which is all about the veil, right? But this separation between the reality that we can understand and the reality that is, inhabited by forces that we don't understand completely. And I think of time travel as that in this game, because time travel allows us to pierce these accepted understandings of the game and create the understandings that the crew was able to create, the understandings that they need to then have this agency to go forth and change the world, right? And that's made possible primarily because there's this science fiction element of time travel. We get to see how technology, the kind of terminal end of technology in, I think, 2300, where we find one of our party members, Robo, and we see that the world has been devastated and folks are one of the most comedic parts of the game was when you use the what is it called, the device that restores your HP and MP, but just
Enertron,
the
yeah.
Intertron, but you're
Yeah.
still hungry after because there's no food, right? Like that.
Yeah.
The first time that happened, that was hilarious. I was like, yo, this, I mean, and it fits the theme. Everybody's hungry. One of the things you do in that quest is you go and you find out that there's no food for these people who are stranded in this terrible, messed up future, right? And so the technological aspects allow us to move between these worlds, right? Move between these phases of reality where we gain this advanced understanding of what's going on. And I think that is the crux, right? That kind of um I don't want to say liminal, but that kind of like in between element that exists at kind of the nexus of like, here is where our understanding of technology and science has brought us, and then we come to this point where our knowledge is exhausted, and then here's where we have to start believing that there's something that is beyond our understanding. I think Chrono Trigger does a really good job of getting us to that intersection, but it doesn't do it in a way. I think we talked about BioWare games. It doesn't do it in a way that like Mass Effect does, right? Where Mass Effect gives you all of the engineering notes on how the Mass Effect systems actually, the Mass Effect devices work, but doesn't take us into the esoteric parts of this, that like, are the beings that created these things gods? How are they immortal? Like what? Like it doesn't get into those pieces, right? And I think it when games don't do that, it's kind of a missed opportunity. Chrono Trigger does it, and it does it so subtly. Like you experience these understandings through the members of your party, right? And so
Yeah.
narratively, it does an excellent job of using these kind of genre trappings to get at the deeper themes using the characters. I feel like in terms of story, I see why Chrono Trigger is regarded as one of the best video game stories of all time, because it uses the creators use every narrative tool that they had to really implant these themes in this story at every level. You know what I mean? Through the characters, through the plot, through the time travel mechanics, through the combat even. You know what I mean? And how the characters work together to resolve combat situations, the things you can do in and out of combat, those mechanics are all in service of these themes and this larger understanding of what we are capable of doing as a community, if we do the things that
I
we need to do, use the tools we have to uncover new understandings. But hey, let's see, you want to say something? I'm
Yeah,
curious about what you
and
meant.
community is so interesting because, like, as you're talking, I'm thinking a lot about you bring up Zeal, which is 12,000
Yeah,
BCE, and
say a little more about Zeal if you don't
yeah,
mind.
and
Yeah,
so
Yeah.
so Zeal is like what is really interesting is Zeal is this like very distinct like distinct symbol of like authoritarianism, where you
mm-hmm,
have the kingdom of Zeal above the clouds. And
mm-hmm,
it's like a fantasy utopia. It's beautiful. Everybody has magic. It's like looks idyllic from the outside. Below
mm-hmm,
on the surface, there's storms raging that never end. It's an ice age, and then you have the earthbound ones who live in these destitute villages, and they have no magic. They're not allowed to have magic, and they're oppressed by the kingdom of Zeal. The residents of Zeal have no idea really that the earthbound ones exist. They think that their life exists because of magic. The magic itself is being exploited and drawn from Lavos, which is like this
mm-hmm.
space parasite that's the game's main antagonist. Um, but ultimately, it leads to Zeal's downfall. In the game, Zeal literally crumbles, and the Earthbound ones and the people from Zeal have to mix. And then you fast forward like 2,300 or well, 15,300 years later to the future, where you're talking about like the Enertron, and magic no longer exists because Lavos, in 1999 AD, has sucked everything he can from the Earth. He's exploited the planet as much as it can, I guess.
Mhm.
And then it leaves, explodes out of a volcano and leaves. So there's no magic. But 2300 AD, you have the fragments of humanity left over, sort of bunkered in this post-apocalyptic world. They live in sort of these science, the remnants of like a scientific utopia. So you have like the fantasy
Mhm.
utopia, scientific utopia. They now live in the crumbled ruins of the scientific utopia. They can no longer rely on magic, and they have to. Their solution to the future of humanity is not like magic will save us, this external force will save us. It's we have this seed, we have this sapling,
Mhm.
which is a different sapling than the one that grows the forest from the desert, but we have this seed, and it will be our savior if we work together to do that. Nobody's coming to save
Mhm.
us. And I think that like Chrono Trigger has these really entrenched themes, like Troy's saying, but they don't hit you over the head with them. They don't say, hey,
Mhm.
compare how Zeal tried to, or here's how Zeal tried to solve their problems. Here's how the problems sort of persist in 2300 AD, and here's the solution they have to take forward. The player has to piece those together and think about,
Mhm.
the different versions of Utopia and why and how one
Mhm.
failed the other, and how we can't rely on external forces or promises that are just too good to be true, or methods of, exploitation to save us. It's about coming together in that community and
Yeah.
relying on humanity's ingenuity and ability to be communal, to create a
Yeah.
future.
Yeah, like Chrono Trigger is a super anti-capitalist game, yo. Like I think about one of the bosses being called the Mamma Machine. You know
Yeah.
what I'm saying? Like that's ill. Like I love
Yeah.
that piece, right? And I think the point I love the point about like we can't rely on exploitation because how Zeal got messed up and how a lot of these terminal elements in terms of the world's development came into play was because folks thought they were going to be able to extract power from Lavos and use it to exploit or to oppress other people, right? So like you see, and I think that's one of the game's core things, but like I said, it doesn't hit you over the head with it. It's really in that last third of the game where a lot of those thematic elements coalesce and you start to realize, oh, okay, this game is trying to tell me something about not just power, but how we approach power, how we, our communities and we individually approach power and how we use it to elevate our situations and what the fallout of that can be if we don't rely on each other and if we don't act in ways or what am I saying? If we don't behave ourselves, right? Which is the instruction Chrono got at the beginning of the game. And one of the earliest elements we see play out of how if you don't act as a member of the community, if you don't act with other people's realities in mind, you may end up, in a messed up situation. You may have the court decide that you're a bad person and now you have to be executed in 3 days, which is the thing that happens at the beginning of the game, if you spend your time at the Millennial Fair, which is the opening kind of, I guess it's the opening quest, but the opening area, tutorial area, if you spend your time there eating other people's food and trying to, being a jerk, that can come back to haunt you.
Stealing people's magical pendants off the ground,
Yeah,
not helping them
yeah.
up when they fall. Yeah,
All of that, yo. And so like it
yeah.
encourages you to be a good member of the community and to not be exploitative, which I again, this game coming along this early and having this depth of thematic complexity, thematic elegance, and being a
Mhm.
video game, again, like this epic fantasy novel video game is just amazing narratively to
Mhm.
experience it again at my big age.
So your insights and sort of unpackings there have like crystallized a few things for me that I want to share, which is one is that I keep hearing actually in the things you're saying, each of you, like the way that this game and its creation captures the kind of combinatorial logic of creative production, which is to say that they're actually fusing together lots of different narrative traditions and genres, cycles. So there's Thomas More's Utopia, the way that Aidan, you described Zeal, like that idea of like the savage others who are excluded from the utopia, but whose existence undergirds the thriving of the residents of the utopia is right in that original formulation of utopia in some sense. And Troy, the way you were talking reminded me a bit of the War of the Worlds, right? Or excuse me, not the War of the Worlds, the other H.G. Wells, the Time Machine. Well, so I mean,
Time
it's right in
machine.
there, right? The Time Machine and the idea of the surface dwellers and the underground dwellers and power and hierarchy and the sort of challenging and dissolution of those. That like I think a lot of what they're doing, and it gets back to Aidan's point about the kind of reciprocal inspiration between sort of like, if you want to say like Western and Eastern traditions and fantasy, like there's a lot of thoughtful borrowing and recombination that makes these stories legible. And like you were saying, I loved, Troy, that you said that you corrected yourself from thematic complexity to thematic elegance, because I actually think that that's what works so well here. And we were calling it earlier a storybook quality, but that it's not so much that it's the most complicated story. It's not like, oh, it's the most lore-rich story. And like we've been saying, they don't give you the codex of the explanations of how everything works. Instead, it's like everything, all of the creative choices feel like they're rowing in the same direction and encouraging you, not in a didactic way, to kind of think about what lessons might lie in some of these case studies, I guess, about power. And that brings me to the other thing that's crystallized, which is the wrapping through of magic and science into each other. I mean, time travel is first presented as a scientific advance, and then later as a kind of like mystical or magical advance. And I think in this game and a lot of games in this, like, we might say like frequently Japanese role-playing cycle of games, especially in the 90s maybe, is that you see people groups, elites trying to emulate magical powers that come from the earth, from numinous realms with technology. And then, finding out the way that like extraction exploitation happens through that transmutation of magic into tech, in an effort usually to scale or to control the technology or the magic to make it more predictable. But also in a sense, it like that kind of cyclical kind of dialogue between magic and science means that like they're drawing the line that both of these systems are frequently used to achieve power, to exert power over others, to reinforce hierarchy. And in this game, the threat of kind of autocracy is ever present. I mean, it's really like the existence of powerful energies, be they technological or magical, is dangerous because it's tempting for people to exploit those technologies or those tools, you could say. And I think that in some ways is maybe some of the moral program of the game, is to think about like, well, how can we think of ways that people can use power that are pro-social and not antisocial? And what are all of the different ways that people justify to themselves grasping at power and then exerting it on others? Like what is that process of trying to talk yourself into you being the sort of good guy in each of these little case studies? How does that play out for different people with different personalities?
And I think like you see a lot of that reflected in the character of Magus or Janus in the game, because he represents sort of the main antagonist for the first 6 to 10 hours of the game. You think he's the evil wizard who's summoning Lavos. He's united all the like the bad guys or the monsters in 600 AD, and he's trying to summon Lavos. You kind of battle through to get to him. And you find out that it's exactly the opposite, that he's found this community of like, the bad guys, and he's brought them together because he sees and he understands the exploitation that led to what happened in 12,000 BCE, because he lived there and he was one of the Zeo royal family, and he was projected into the future. He saw the consequences of his mom, who was the queen's actions, and said, no, this is too much. And so in that way, he takes on sort of the hero role, the protagonist role of saying what was happening was wrong and I'm going to fix that. And so he's trying to summon Lavos in 600 AD, not to destroy the world, not to extract his power, but to defeat Lavos so that the world going forward could be better. And that's very complex, I think, at the time when, I was coming from something like Final Fantasy VI, which has a lot of interesting things to say. And, Kefka is the main antagonist in that game, and he has a lot of interesting things to say, but ultimately it was saying things about the Empire and the exploitation of their super soldiers to try to unlock magical powers in those super soldiers. And then that cracked Kefka. But Kefka's actions had no intentionality to them other than to cause chaos and death and destruction. Magus was the exact opposite of that. He was, like very much the, well-intentioned person who, sets things awry. And I think that that kind of touches back on what you were just talking about, Joey, in terms of, you know, recognizing that there's so much, you know, just like layers to the way that Chrono Trigger looks at its themes. It doesn't try to hit you over the head with one thing.
Yeah.
You know, and then you go to the future and you see Lavos appear from the ground, destroying the, you know, the technological utopia, and recognizing that all the exploitation that led to that utopia was still not enough to save it,
Mhm.
right? And those sorts of things kind of all tie together. Like no matter what Magus or Janus could do, he couldn't save himself because the sort of communal and long-term exploitation of Lavos's energy, which represents sort of the natural resource extraction exploitation, you know, it just cumulatively was too much. And so understanding what went wrong in the first place and making sure it doesn't happen again is sort of the key takeaway there, that nobody is able to really solve until Chrono and Co come along, but they can still only solve the problem from, you know, 1000 AD on. They can't go back and solve things for Zeal. They can't go back to the future. The future they travel to is still, you know, dystopian. Until like you get the very best ending in the game, and then you see a glimpse that maybe things are healing.
You can hear in Aidan's like descriptions of elements of this game and how they braid together the sense of another genre, I think, in here, which is like the detective story. And that, you know, figuring out that you're sort in some sense chasing the wrong guy is part of that detective story. That the person you think is the antagonist, your major antagonist, is actually kind of you know, attempting to do the same thing you're doing. He's almost sort of a dark double of your party, but then in some sense also is enmeshed in this larger history that you still don't fully understand. And so I think it captures something too that the both science fiction and fantasy can do quite well, and that comes together well in this game, which is thinking long term, thinking really far back and thinking really far forward. And the game literalizes all that. But one thing I kept, it's probably just because I've been reading too many detective novels lately, but it did make me think of this game as a kind of, you know, historical fiction detective story, and that it's both challenging you to project forward and project backwards and think about causality in both directions, and then start to think time travel wise about these causal loops and these themes that repeat over time. Like, but it's like your party and you yourself are veiled from a lot of that quite early on. You only have your own little slice of time to adjudicate matters from, and so the broader picture that you're able to see allows you to understand people's motivations better, and to understand this sort of cycles of history with these attempts to kind of domesticate and direct ungovernable magical energies, and you know, which can perhaps stand in for unruly technologies too. That you see this happening
Absolutely.
time over time. Troy, go ahead, please.
Absolutely. I think you're really hitting on it here, especially because one of the really cool ways that the game introduces us to this idea, and I've only really, even though I've known about the idea of big time in terms of like how small of a speck we are in the the continuum of time that we've existed, right? One of the really awesome things, again, just thinking narratively, but also a little bit mechanically in terms of the party, right? Because you recruit your party members from these different eras, and these folks are steeped in whatever their situation is in that era, and it is inevitably tied to this gigantic central conflict that is Lavos and the history of Zeal and the history of magic and how magic is transition. This transition is happening. You recruit characters. I don't. Yeah. So like when you meet Frog, for example, like Frog is directly related to this gigantic central conflict in these very, very small ways. And when you talk to them, when you interact with them, especially in the last third of the game, when you start to learn more about what drives them and their motivations and their more about their histories, you get to understand that they in some ways typify what the mood is in their time and how we're thinking about the game, how we're exposed to the game's themes, right? Like Frog, I just like focus on him because I didn't expect to connect to his character as much as I did. I'd always seen like when you think about the game's art,
This
right?
is,
You
by
think
the
about
way,
like marketing for
this is a frog who is a knight. Who's a medieval knight and
Yes.
who speaks in kind of these and thous and
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
yeah, yeah. So go on,
For as
Troy,
much
but
as
just
yeah, so Frog is a character who has been affected by like transmutation magic. He's been cursed and he's been turned into by Magus, turned into a frog. His character, he's a very meek guy at first. When you meet him, he's a squire to the strongest knight in the 600 AD kingdom, right? And so his as you work through his character and as you work through his arc, you start to see that like one of the things that he represents is the tenacity of the people who exist in these communities to right the wrongs that they perceive have happened, right? In the face of odds that are well beyond even their understanding. And so that is what this character brings to the table when you are adventuring through this world with him. And I think um, the narrative quality of this game is such that when you think about it, like if you think about it as a novel, right? If you think about it as a typical fantasy story, um, this character, I think that's where the video game makes it a lot more rich because this character in a book would be very typical, right? And it's a typical kind of character archetype. You think about knights who have been cursed. A lot of fantasy
Mhm.
literature has knights who have been cursed and turned into other things, or turned green, or now they have hedgehog heads, or whatever, right? So this is a very standard Western fantasy trope that is used in this video game to really explore what does this type of character what is this type of character concerned about in their context? How do they bring this concern to the larger party? How do they interact with the larger party with their concerns and with their understandings and ideas in mind? And then how do we as a group together take this character's knowledge and understanding, this character's core skills, this character's abilities in terms of the mechanics of the game when we think about combat? Um, and how do we use that to overcome this situation? And how do we do that knowing that there's going to be a world or a timeline where this has happened and there is no changing it. And that's so again when I think about how seamlessly all of these aspects are interwoven in this game to tell that small piece of story for that one character and have it continue to connect to this larger situation. Um, and have it continue to. I think we talked about smoke and mirrors. I think Aidan mentioned like the smoke and mirrors of this game's narrative and also kind of in its mechanics because I didn't in my emulated version I didn't have like a game book or anything and because I'm playing on a weird controller the controls didn't make a lot of sense to me, right? And so like I didn't know until a while into the game that like the texts were actually combinations of text, right? They were teaming up. You
Can
can
you,
see it
yeah, I
happen,
was
right?
gonna say, could you say more about that? Because you mentioned it
Yeah,
a few
yeah.
times, this that the mechanical way that the party members kind of collaborate, you could say.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. And so in combat, you of course each character has their own individual techniques that they learn as they gain experience points and level up. But in addition to those techniques, and in addition to magic spells, which you only unlock a few hours into the game, going to the end of time, which is awesome. And there's an old guy there, but anyway, you have standard attacks, so like skills that you have, like Chrono's a swords person, and so he has swords person skills, and you get magic. But then you also have combination attacks that two characters can team up on. And it's so interesting to see how well each character's like combination techniques reflect on not just their like class in terms of RPG classes, but also their character, right? So like just continue with the Frog example. Frog, I mean, I think in terms of class, Frog is a paladin, right? So he has healing magic and he also, has some combat capability. But in terms of his combination attacks with other characters, what he seeks to do is to bring out the power in other characters in their attacks, right? And so the fusion attacks that he has often, and it also relies on his ability. You learn in his history that he's probably the best fighter among those knights, even though he's not a knight, he's a squire. And even though he has a very meek personality, right? So here we have this idea that one of the people who is essential to solving this existential problem is in fact one of maybe the most technically accomplished individuals, but also one of the individuals that's most afraid to do anything. But throughout his quest, throughout his narrative, he finds that ability, right? And and there are some intersections between like his more traditional fantasy story and a character like Robo, right? Who who has an entirely different. You find Robo in the future, in this desolate future, and this character comes with you. And now through the quest to get this character, you meet other characters who again exemplify these notions of the impossibility of what it is you're actually doing as a party once you're, deciding to
Mhm.
move in the direction of trying to thwart this ancient threat and all of the people who have attempted to utilize this ancient threat to their benefit. So I really
Mhm.
love, I really love again just how expertly I think. I don't even know if it was. I can't even. I mean, we know they were superstars, but what I know is when you have a lot of creative powerhouses in the space, sometimes the alchemy that happens is not intentional. Like sometimes it really is just a spirit got in a room and it got in everybody, and some awesome ideas came out of it. But when I think about these combinations of genre elements and how it ties into these themes and how these elements work together to tell a story that maybe nowadays we have quite a few examples of, but I these elements put together in these combination in a video game I hadn't seen until I would say one of the late, like Final Fantasy 12, maybe, right? Like where you
Mhm.
have a technological kingdom that has technology, and there's ancient magic that comes from elder beings, and folks are trying to exploit them, and there's all this political tension. And this game doesn't have the political tension like that. There's no Game of Thrones type, no kind of like Byzantine stuff going on here. They're kingdoms, they exist. Sometimes they're fighting, sometimes they're not. So like all these elements just work together really well to communicate these
Mhm.
additional layers of like understanding that we need to have, and we learn that through the party. And we learn that, like I said, like Chrono's understanding expands as he meets these people in these different timelines,
Mhm.
and that also expands our understanding, and it leads to this smoke and mirrors effect that we get, where we start to uncover these additional elements of understanding just by going on adventures and meeting these people and playing the game. And I think that's
Mhm.
again for as early as this game was to see these elements nearly perfected, like for real, like nearly,
Mhm.
like not I there are games that have done individual parts of these systems well, but like to see it just so seamlessly connected together is again mind blowing for me.
So, Troy, what you've been talking about actually brings up something I'd been hoping to ask Aidan about, which is about the ensemble, about the
Mm,
the idea that we've talked about. You have the silent protagonist. His name's literally Chrono, so it's like his name's like in the title of the game, and he has a sword and spiky hair, and so in some sense he's like who you expect as a protagonist. But it really first, Aidan, I just want to invite you to share your take on what on sort
Yeah.
of who the protagonist really is, and then maybe the notion that the party as a whole functions to fill some of the roles that we might expect from like a singular fantasy protagonist, for example.
Yeah, I think like, we talked earlier about silent protagonists and how often they're sort of ciphers for the player, right? They're sort of a vessel for the player to insert themselves into the game. And Chrono's very much that. Like he doesn't have a backstory really. He's a guy, a sword fighter who is like buff and lives at home with his mom. Like, he like that's who he is, right? And so he bumps into Marl early on in the game, and then you get launched into this little time traveling adventure. It turns out Marl is actually the princess from his time, Nadia, and then they get kicked into the future. Um, and that's where they discover the source of the destruction of the future. So they live in 1000 AD, which is fairly idyllic, especially before
Mhm.
they go back in time to 600 AD. So the first sort of inciting event in the game is that Marl gets sucked into this time vortex. Chrono goes after her because he's the hero and he saves her. But in the process, because the queen got kidnapped, because of what happened, the chancellor in 600 AD says, "Oh, we really need to tighten up the justice system in
mm,
this kingdom." So they go 400 years back into the future. Marl's been saved, the kingdom's been saved. the timeline's been saved. But you get back to the future, and all of a sudden, the chancellor in that time is like, this pro cop, like authoritarian figure who is like has this really strong sense of justice. So we talked earlier about the fair, and there are things you can do at the fair. You can talk to Marl before you pick up her pendant. You can, bring the cat back to her kid. You can not eat somebody's lunch. And all of those things add up. The game tracks them. You get to a trial scene, which is one of the game's most famous scenes, and you can get guilty or not guilty based on your actions. Super cool. But what happens, even if you get guilty, is you still get thrown in jail for running away with the princess for 3 days. And then you find out that the chancellor's like, oh, well, I don't believe that guy. No matter what the trial says, we're going to execute him anyway. And so that sort of sets off this escape. You escape again into another time vortex, go into the future. It's destroyed. And then you find out that Lavos did this. And it's not Chrono who steps forward. Chrono's been like, he stepped forward to go into the time portal, and that's sort of his inciting incident. After that, Marl sort of takes over as the moral protagonist of the game. So she's the one, despite living this intensely privileged life in 1000 AD, which is, by all intents and purposes, idyllic, especially for her.
And which will continue to be idyllic.
Which will continue. She could live out, and so could
yeah.
Chrono, and so could Chrono's best friend, Luca. They could all live out their lives in like a utopia, essentially. As far as they're concerned, or as far as their lives are, they could go back to 1000 AD and just grow old, and Marl could become the queen, and Chrono could continue to work out at his mom's house. Luca could make inventions, and they'd all be good. There are very low personal stakes, but Nadia or Marl sees what Lavos does, sees the future that Lavos has created, and says she's the one that says, we need to stop this. Our mission, our goal now is to stop this. And so, over the years, I always used to think of Chrono as like, the protagonist of Chrono Trigger. His name's in the title of the game, but I've come around to the idea that Marl is sort of the moral protagonist of the game, the one that takes action and is proactive in terms of not just like escape. Like Chrono reacts to things. Marl in that instance makes the active choice to pursue the story and to save the world. And that to me has always stuck out as something that is really unique in games, that you have this immensely privileged person. Like usually the princess in the game is, irritating or precocious, and she needs to kind of grow over time. But you see Marl step forward immediately and throw all of that aside and say, literally, we need to stop this. I need to save these people who won't exist for 1500 years, and make changes where I can to do that. And I think that that's really remarkable, and then dovetails nicely into Troy's point that Chrono Trigger is not the story of one person. It is the story of the party, and they all have their own motivations, because the conflicts of 600 AD are different than 1000 AD, which are different of, the future or the past. And all of those coming together kind of shows that conflict is solved not by hyper focusing on the one thing that exists in your life, but by raising, all the boats around you and working together to solve all those problems, because we all bring something different to, each of the journeys that we're on. And that's where that community aspect comes back in. And Robo's motivations are very different than Frog's motivations, right? Robo is a robot who, his whole conflict is about the idea of free will and whether that exists, whether that can be created in, an artificial intelligence. And I think that resonates very strongly with looking at Frog, who, like Troy was saying, is an accomplished sword fighter, but always puts himself behind others and tags himself to other people, whether that was the knight that he was the squire to, Cyrus, whether that was the queen he feels like he failed to protect. But through meeting these other people and going on these journeys with them, they sort of drag him out of the mud over and over and over again until he finally sees, like, oh no, like I can be part of this, as an active person, parallel to the other people at my side. I'm not behind them, but I'm with them. And so I think, Chrono doesn't really exemplify any of that, except that he is the one that sort of acts as the gravity well around them. And then the game can't make Chrono Trigger can't make Chrono himself compelling, but what they can do is show the reactions of his friends to things that happen to him. And there's a famous twist in the middle of the game. I don't know how
Mhm.
deeply we want to spoil that, but something
Mhm.
happens and that galvanizes those around him. And that alone, you see how Chrono was the one that sort of brought everybody together in that way.
Mhm.
Even if he wasn't the one making the active choices or facing conflict, he was
Mhm.
the one that sort of, like kept everybody aligned so that they could help each other in those situations.
It almost makes you wonder if that was the point of Chrono. You know what I'm saying? The thing that happens, like, because it is the crux of, like, you think, and this again is a new player,
Guys,
right?
guys,
How come?
it is a 30-year-old game. I think we could probably just say, uh, if you need to, Troy, to make your point, then you should feel free.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take the cuffs off there.
Okay. All right. Cool. Cool. So yeah, like, and if you, I remember being a kid and Aerith dying in Final Fantasy VII and being like, "Yo, this is amazing," but like, well, not amazing, but like, this is it's wild that they did this. But like, Chrono Trigger predated that. Chrono dies.
Mhm.
Chrono actually sacrifices himself in your first encounter with Lavos, and you can make the decision to not like revive him, which I think is like hilarious. Like the fact that that choice is even given to you. But I wonder if that was his point. Like, I
Yeah.
think in a sense, like, Aerith served the same purpose, right? Like we had her, her character and her like mythos has grown outside of that moment. But I think narrative is like, if you needed a character who you could implant yourself on as the hero, even though you're not really the hero, the heroism is coming from the folks who you gather to your side, from your community, right? And then you have this opportunity to make this big self-sacrifice action to continue to work. Like as a player, right? In terms of player agency, that makes me feel awesome. Like I can be the hero in this aspect, right? And I think we talked about Bioware games earlier. One of my biggest complaints about Bioware games is that Bioware games try to manufacture that kind of heroism in characters through these choices that ultimately they are many and they are varied and they are complex and they are, algorithmic or whatever. But at the end of the day, a lot of those choices are meaningful only because of the scripted effects they have in the game, not because of how they might make you feel in a truly transformative sense for the game. And I think Chrono really did that as a character. And I wonder, like especially with the storytelling titans who were on board with this game, like I could imagine again the spirit coming in and somebody having an idea saying maybe this is
Yeah.
this character's
Chrono,
point is
like,
toward.
yeah.
Mm-hmm,
Chrono not having personal conflict almost makes that more interesting, right? Like
mm-hmm,
he's not a sad frog knight who wants to like prove that he, doesn't always fail. He's not grappling with free will or privilege.
yeah,
He's just a guy who, you know, the only cost to his sacrifices to him personally and the friends
yeah.
around him, right? And that's the same as a player. We have no conflict on with the resolution of Chrono Trigger, right? We can turn the system off and our lives continue on the same way that they always would have, right? But we're choosing to go forward all the time. And Chrono, without having that backstory, without having conflict, without having things that he has to himself solve, he gives space and lifts up those conflicts around him in a way that's really interesting because then we start seeing as
Mm-hmm,
ourselves in the secondary characters, right? We're
yeah.
always supposed to see
Mm-hmm,
ourselves as a hero of the story, but like stories don't have singular heroes, right? They
mm-hmm,
have, they have communal heroes. They're everybody
yeah,
around there. There's no
yeah,
Japanese RPG out there that would have happened without the people surrounding the hero. And
yeah,
Chrono is just such a catalyst for that. And I
yeah.
think it's almost more interesting that he's not the secret, you know, heir to the magic or whatever. Like it turns out that
Right.
Nadia and Marl is, right? Like she's descended from the magical, like royal family of Zeal, not Chrono. And I think that almost makes him more interesting. He's just a dude. And he's just a
Mm-hmm,
dude on an adventure. And that's something that's not often seen, especially in this genre. Like the main character is always mythologized in some way. He
mm-hmm,
always, or they always turn out to be something unique or special.
mm-hmm.
And Chrono Trigger just doesn't do that. And I think that's really unique.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one thing that, that I've taken from this is that, there's a power to like having two of the first characters you meet, or really all the first group of characters you meet, make a volitional choice to get involved in something that doesn't, in some sense, involve them. The later party members that you add, as you all have been saying, they all like have a stake in this Lavos plot, this alien parasite, all the political and environmental chaos it causes. These people don't. They're in some ways in this island of historical privilege, even, just accidental for a couple of them and hereditary for another. But it's that volitional decision to say, like, I'm responsible to the planet. I'm a planetary citizen. I'm not just responsible for like my immediate circumstances. And that's what the game, I think, in some sense, that's the moral program of the game. And that's maybe, to wrap around to my premise, like that's the power of having science fiction and fantasy, because we associate science fiction so much with futurity. We associate fantasy frequently, high fantasy particularly, with deep pasts. And so being able to tether those together and then having this sort of present 1999, right? This 1990s present, which is still very fantasy tinged, but like feels more recognizably everyday to us, allows us to say like, okay, well, we're living in these genres as a way of talking about our kind of larger planetary and temporal responsibilities to one another.
I like that idea too, because like so much of like time travel and science fiction, it's, it's future looking. Fantasy is also almost always backwards looking. But Chrono Trigger and time travel, I like that even with the time travel, it doesn't say like, oh, we can go back and fix the past, right? It doesn't look to fixing the past as the opportunity to improve the future. It always challenges you to move forward and to look what you can do to make tomorrow better. And science fiction often looks at, what has happened in the past that has sort of led to this conflict. Fantasy is always about so often, and not always, obviously there's so many exceptions and it's such a broad field, but like the mold of fantasy, say, that Yuji Horii was looking at when he created Dragon Quest was very much about like restoring status quo, right? There was so much of that, like 80s style epic fantasy from Terry Brooks or from people like that was about restoring and maintaining status quo. But Chrono Trigger takes those two ideas of like, here's the future, what went wrong, like where are we going from here, and the past idea of restoring the status quo, and say, no, like it's about building better futures. It's not about sort of going back to the past. There's two instances in Chrono Trigger where you can travel to specific instances to try to fix the past. One of them is saving Luca's mom from an accident. And so you go back to a very specific moment, but to get there, you have to go through a very specific string of events as well. It's not something they can do on a whim. And the other one is you go back to the very moment that Chrono dies. And again, you have to go through all these quest lines to be able to do that. And I think the fact that there's like high effort involved in going back and fixing specific things thematically ties into the idea of like, science fiction doesn't teach us what like to do. It teaches us, like how we need to think about building better futures. And Chrono Trigger very much does that. It says, you need to think about tomorrow, not yesterday.
Yeah.
So
time travel.
I was going to say we're up on time here. Speaking of time, but Troy, I want to give you a chance to respond and expand on that a bit, and then I'll wrap us up. But I would very much like to hear what you have to say first.
Yeah, for sure. So, of course, as I'm playing this time travel game, I'm thinking about it from the lens of things I've written about for CSI and things I think about a lot, which is the concept of Afrofuturism, which is very, very concerned with time. And thinking about it from that perspective, and when you think about like African cosmology, in some cultures, there is the idea that time's a circle, so we are just in this loop. We're just going around, right? And that's not unique to African cosmology. That's the feature in a lot of different cultures, understanding of time, right? But I do think that the time travel piece was the piece that really crystallizes the possibility space that the genre fusion creates. I think I mentioned earlier that when we think about the folkloric quality of the game, the time travel piece is the piece that pierces the veil for the characters, so they're able to have increased understanding of the forces in the world that are making the world as it is. They literally understand the God in the machine, basically, or the God at the center of the earth, or the entity at the center of the earth, because they can time travel. I think time travel is also the element that makes it so we are able to have this very holistic understanding of the impact of these things on the world for all these characters in all of these different multiplicative ways. And it's interesting that it does that without creating a multiverse, right? It just says this is this continuous timeline that you are in. And the past, when I think about it from my lens as an Afrofuturist and as somebody who thinks about time, in the way that I do from my Black perspective, the past is for lessons. The past is not to change. Those things that
Yeah.
happened in the past are lessons, are ancestral lessons, are historical lessons that you take forward with you into the future to improve your understanding and make better choices. You seek answers from the past. You seek
Mhm.
answers beyond your understanding from the past to use in the future, right? To secure your future. And so I think that time travel element really does. It's one of the elements that I think is used very well outside of our understanding, our typical understanding, even though he uses a very typical way. Thematically, the way time travel is used really is an atypical use of it because of how it's moving you through this typical fantasy world and these scientific worlds in ways that are not, again, not focused on mechanically what's happening, but focused on you in your human space and your with your mind getting an understanding of here are the elements at play that are not just a threat to the people in this video game universe, right?
Mhm.
Thinking about the 1990s, and thinking about the culture this game came from. This is not just a threat to these characters in the video game universe. This is a threat to you, and you can't travel through time and stop things or prevent things or make
Yeah.
decisions in the future that
Mhm.
might impact. You have to do this now, and
Yeah.
so the game's lesson, I think, is really timely. One, right, playing it in 2024, and I think the other piece is that if I think about if I had played this at 8 years old, I definitely wouldn't have got any of that. I definitely wouldn't have had my understanding of time travel as a narrative device and as a metaphysical device that cultures
Mhm.
use to, understand the past to determine the future, right? So I think in some aspects, it was really good that I played this 30 years after it came out because I have these advanced understandings. Um, but I don't think it would have been too difficult to at least start to glean these things as an 8 year old either.
Mhm.
So that's another really good narrative thing that the game does really well, especially in blending genres and using time travel as this device to tie all these pieces together to increase our understanding of what's happening and what we need to do.
I think too, like the blending of genres shows us that conflicts are human conflicts, whether you're fighting a lightning dinosaur or you're fighting a
Yeah,
robot in the future or you're fighting a mage in 600 AD. It
absolutely.
all is the same thing at its core, right? And it's about stewardship for the future and creating better worlds for the people that are coming behind us. Whether you're in 65 million BC or you're in 2300 BC and you're building towards 2300 BC in one day. Um, it doesn't matter what you're fighting. It doesn't matter what's surrounded you. Human conflicts and human, responsibilities have been the same since, we existed. And, going back as far back as, you know, our memories and our histories and our people and our beliefs have existed. It's been about building better futures for the people around us and those in the future that we don't know because we have a responsibility for them, even if it doesn't explicitly right now in this moment impact us.
Mhm.
That's really wonderful. Thank you both so much for those insights. And Troy, I love the idea of thinking this in light of Afrofuturism and revisiting in that light. I think that's a thinking of the kinship between the way that they conceptualize time and then Aidan thinking about better futures and responsibility. Um, and yeah, thank you both for kind of deepening my understanding of this genre fusion because I think it's still rather alchemical to quote myself that how it pulls it off, but I think I have a much better understanding of the mechanics of it and why it seems to work so well. Aidan, did you want to add something before
I
we
just said I want to go back and play Chrono Trigger, thinking about what Troy
I
was just
know,
talking
yeah.
about, like from those
Okay.
perspectives and like better understandings or more complex or more full understandings of how those stories, especially about time travel and all that, like, I don't know. I just want to go back because every time I go to Chrono Trigger, I take something else away from it too, which I think is remarkable. And just hearing, like your experiences and Troy's experiences makes me feel like there's a new experience waiting for me with the game in a way that, not many other games can give me.
Yeah, I heartily agree. Well, we've all got to get on the schedule you're on of playing it every year, I think, probably.
Okay. Yeah.
The way to do
Very
it.
good, Troy.
But like Chrono Trigger, like I don't know how long it took you guys for your first playthrough, but I remember like we went way back. My first experience with Chrono Trigger, I remember it took me like 2 weeks to get to Zeal the first time, right? And then I played New Game Plus, and I remember running out of my bedroom 2 days after starting New Game Plus and be like, "Mom, Mom, Mom! Like I'm already at the Kingdom of Zeal. It took me 2 weeks to get there the first time. It took me 2 days this time." And so like Chrono Trigger fits itself into your life in ways that might not be immediately noticeable, because it gives, again, we talk about player agency. You can play it and I can beat it in 8.5 hours now, or I can play it
Oh,
and it can
wow.
take me 20 hours,
Yeah.
and so like that choice of how you experience and how you
Mhm.
interact with it changes based on what the person wants from that experience. So anyway, yes, play Chrono Trigger every year. It'll be different for you
Absolutely.
every time.
All
I'm gonna
right.
try not to play it on a MacBook Pro next time.
Be nice if they did a modern remaster of like the Steam version on consoles. Like,
We're all voting
From
for
your
that, I
lips to
think
Square
here.
Enix's ears, bro.
Yes.
yeah, accessibility of old games is a whole other episode, I think. But
Yes,
Yeah, for sure.
I completely agree. Well, thank you but you both so much, Aidan and Troy, for joining me today for CSI Skill Tree, and we're excited to do more episodes. To be notified about our upcoming episodes, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com/imagineasu, or you can visit our website, which is csi.asu.edu, where you can subscribe to our email updates. You can learn more about Aidan and his work at aidanmoher.com, AIDANMOHER.com, and learn more about Troy and his work at troylwiggins.com, TROYLWIGGINS.com. I'd like to also, as always, thank my colleagues at the Center for Science and the Imagination for making this event and series possible, and allowing us to have these conversations, and especially to Om Gawali for editing the video and integrating gameplay and doing all the wonderful things that enliven this conversation. So, but once again, Troy, Aidan, thank you for sharing this time with me and sharing your thoughts and playthrough as well.
yeah, thanks so much. This was wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Joy, for the opportunity. Really appreciate it.